And that's exactly the case in Charlie Kirk's case. Charlie Kirk is not a Nazi. They didn't kill Charlie Kirk because he was a Nazi. They killed Charlie Kirk because he wasn't a Nazi. They killed Charlie Kirk because he talked to people in the public square in a moderate and a persuasive way. And
Hey guys, welcome to the Resilient Show. And if you're watching, you could tell we're not in studio. We're not face to face with the guest here. We're actually doing a 9-episode The Resilient Show special, and we've done several Resilient Show specials recently. We're going to be doing more and more of them because we want to be able to respond to real like current events. And today we're going to be talking about the Charlie Kirk assassination and Homeland Security Counter-Terrorism. And if you've watched previous episodes, you've seen me with my friend, Lieutenant Colonel retired Tommy Waller, Fourth Recon Commander, and now the president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., where I serve as a board member. And today's guest is Kyle Shidler, who is, did I say it right, Kyle? Kyle Shidler? Kyle Shidler. So I tried to get it right before we talked about this, but I messed up. So Kyle Shidler, who is the Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counter-Terrorism at the Center for Security Policy. And just to give him some props, you don't get that position as Senior Security Policy unless you are an expert in that field. What the Center for Security Policy has done so well, and I just accolades to Tommy Waller for doing this, is they find the expert in any field, bring them into Center for Security Policy to do just unbiased analysis and be able to provide that information bipartisan across the board to policymakers. And so that's Kyle's job. His job is to analyze data and provide that information for both legislation, policy, and just information on on domestic security through Homeland Security and counterterrorism. So Kyle, thanks for joining me with this. The nation is still pretty shaken. I know I am about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And so to get your expert analysis on that, I'm very thankful to have this time with you.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Before we get started, can you tell us, I gave an intro of you, but can you tell us about your background, what qualifies you to speak on this, to have the position at Center for Security Policy, and maybe, beyond my stab at it, what actually you do at Center for Security Policy?
Sure. So I've been looking at terrorist groups and specifically extremist organizations that help indoctrinate, recruit, train, and influence the people that engage in terrorism for going on about 20 years now. My background out of college was focusing on, actually my degree was in the politics and literature of totalitarian societies. So I was looking back then at a lot of communist, Marxist-Leninist, Maoist type organizations and what they do. And then 9/11 happened. And so I committed myself to taking a look at Islamic movements, Islamist movements in the United States and abroad, and how they function, why they do what they do. And the benefit of working at the Center for Security Policy, for which I'm very grateful every day, is the center has a focus on understanding ideology, understanding doctrine, and specifically helping to explain how what people believe affects what they do and how they do it. So when you're confronting a jihadist terrorist group, when you're confronting a anarchist, anti-fascist, Antifa style group, what they believe about the world affects how they operate in the world. It affects the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they choose. It affects the iconography, the symbols that they select. And I get to spend all day, every day, focusing on that stuff. And then I get to share it with the people who need it. The Center for Security Policy has allowed me to work with briefing local and state and even federal law enforcement agencies on some of these threats, which in some cases are desperately needed, because this approach that I documented is just not really the approach that federal law enforcement and intelligence takes these days. We've seen since the Obama administration and definitely since the Biden administration a tendency towards vagary, a tendency towards not being able to call things what they are. And this has degraded our ability to keep ourselves secure. So what the center has focused on is, understanding these threats the way they understand themselves, using the language that they use, knowing what they mean when they speak, and helping educate other people to understand that for the purpose of defeating them and keeping Americans safer and more secure.
When we talk about the Center for Security Policy being like unbiased and center, can you explain why? What steps you guys put in not to be a partisan organization?
Sure. So, one of the great things about the center is they allow us to, follow the information wherever it leads. There's no constraints. Nobody ever says, we have a donor and the donor wants an article, that says this, or, they want us to take a perspective that says this. And the sad fact is that's not that common in the think tank world anymore. And increasingly, one of the challenges, especially in this space, in the space that I deal in, with extremist groups and ideologies, is very often the individuals who are doing research or in academia claiming to be experts, in fact, are members of these organizations or support them ideologically. You may have seen on X these days, people are talking about this recent Economist piece where an individual attempted to document claims that the far right was far more dangerous than the far left. And what they did not reveal was that individual himself is a self-described member of Antifa. And this happens, unfortunately, all the time in government spaces, in nonprofit spaces, in academia. So there are not experts that federal law enforcement can trust to say, tell me who Antifa is, or tell me how jihadist terrorist groups operate, and not be confident that those people don't have a bias in favor of some of those groups. So the Center for Security Policy, we don't take government money. We're not going to tell the government what they want to hear. We're going to tell them what we honestly believe. We don't take money from any organization or corporation that can profit from our work. We don't sell anything. We offer all of our briefings to law enforcement for free. So we are motivated only to tell them what our analysis suggests to us to be the truth, and they can take that information and do with it what they will. So that's our approach.
And no foreign dollars either. I know,
and especially no foreign dollars, which is increasingly rare, unfortunately, in the think tank world.
Yeah, it's
you
very, very.
You do see pressure with organizations that they just don't criticize certain countries, or they just don't raise certain facts about the bad behavior of certain countries, and unfortunately, that's not as uncommon as you would maybe hope.
Yeah, they're bought, and I mean, plainly, they've been bought and paid for. We talk about partisanship. I am partisan, not to a political party. I'm partisan to my love for America and my the patriotism that I have and the freedoms that we share as Americans. So I'm partisan to that. And one of the things that I've seen shift in the narrative of administrations is an administration, President Biden's administration, where they pretty much endorsed organizations like Antifa, and really backed or certainly wouldn't even call out organizations like Antifa. And now this week, you have President Trump, the new administration, saying he's going to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. What would you say about that shift, first of all, and how and why would President Trump go as far as to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can say that part of the reason we are in the mess that we are in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination is how normalized Antifa's ideology of labeling their opponents as fascist, labeling people who are really centrists, even in some cases center left, as fascists, and seeing that emulated from high level individuals, in politics. I remember during the BLM riots in 2020, as federal law enforcement and U.S. Marshals were trying to secure the federal courthouse in Portland, and you had the Speaker of the House referring to federal law enforcement officers as Gestapo. You see now supposedly mainstream politicians referring to ICE as secret police and referring to ICE detention centers as concentration camps, and then somehow act as though they are surprised when members of Antifa open fire on ICE detention facilities and attack ICE officers. Well, if you tell someone that there are Nazis in the streets and that these people are engaging in secret police tactics and murdering people and sending them to concentration camps, that is the reaction you will get. I mean, it is not an unreasonable reaction from people to think that they need to stop that kind of thing if it were really happening. And of course, it's a gross misconstruction of what is actually happening. So the Biden administration, unfortunately, really in a lot of ways put the pedal to the metal on some of this rhetoric, and that has greatly benefited the black masked rioters and anarchists in the street who take advantage of it. Now, the Trump administration has said that they want to put an end to this. They want to consider designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. Now, as often happens with President Trump, he sort of signals his intentions without necessarily defining how he wants to achieve that in terms of a concrete policy. So we don't actually know what this means in terms of how they want to approach this problem, other than the president is making it a priority. Technically, as I try to remind people, there is no domestic terrorist organization designation. There's no list you can put a group on to label them as a domestic terrorist organization for legal and constitutional reasons. But you can label foreign terrorist organizations for national security reasons. Groups that are foreign-based, that are directed or linked to foreign countries and the like, can be designated as foreign terrorist organizations, and you can, in fact, prohibit people from being members of a terrorist organization, a foreign terrorist organization like Hamas or Hezbollah or something like that. So they could potentially pursue a foreign terrorism designation for Antifa. There is a logic to this. There is, in fact, an Antifa International, and it has links to Antifa chapters in countries all over the world, from Western Europe to South America. We saw, in fact, just this week, both the parliament in the Netherlands issued a statement that a resolution that they believed Antifa should be designated as a terrorist organization. And the president of Hungary, Viktor Orban, also came out and said that they wanted to see Antifa designated as a terrorist organization. And in particular, Hungary has faced a number of attacks by Antifa groups who often cross borders from Germany into Hungary and conduct attacks against Hungarian politicians and other individuals. So this really is an international problem. It really is a foreign threat. And if you know anything about the history of Antifa, which I try to remind people so that they can get an understanding, Antifa grew up. It was created overseas in Germany, both in its original incarnation in the 1930s and then again in the 1980s. So there are foreign links to Antifa. They have foreign ties. There are foreign chapters. They move money internationally. All of these things could be used for a foreign terrorism designation. It will take quite a bit of work, but if properly motivated and properly educated, I believe you could make the case, for the government and ultimately to the American people.
One of the things you mentioned that I think is particularly interesting right now is members of Congress, i.e. Nancy Pelosi, especially during, talking about federal agents and calling them the Gestapo and calling, detention centers, concentration camps. You also have media, the media, even in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death, calling them, divisive, MAGA extremists, racist, transphobic, calling them all these things. And they're saying these things in positions of authority, knowing there's no consequences because no consequences have been imposed. I'm tying some of this back right now to what I believe to be changes made in the Smith-Mundt Act. I'm wondering how familiar you are with the Smith-Mundt Act and what changes did Obama administration, President Biden's administration make to the Smith-Mundt Act to take away consequences or put parameters on what can and can't be said that could lead or incite violence or radicalize people.
Yeah, so there was the Smith-Munn Act, obviously indicated that the U.S. government could not propagandize the American people. It recognized that the U.S. government needs to do public relations abroad. We do need to educate people about the American government and the American way of government and what we believe about the world and why we do the things we do. But it understood that the government should not be telling the American people what to believe. And so there was an attempt to kind of create a firewall there that would protect the American people from the very necessary public diplomacy that the U.S. government does engage in abroad. Most if I was to be most generous to the Obama administration, I would say that they recognize that in the world of social media, it is very, very difficult to send one message abroad and not have it reach Americans at home. And this is a challenge. And I think that there's some legitimacy to that issue. Was revoking this act as opposed to reforming it in some way the correct response? I'm not so sure. So I think we can think about how we would reimpose methods to prevent the U.S. government from unnecessarily propagandizing the American people, unnecessarily censoring the American people, while also recognizing that it does have to do a better job of stating America's case abroad.
So with all that, this rhetoric that was allowed to be said towards someone publicly like Charlie Kirk, there's lots of things that could have led to his assassination. But if you say something enough, I think there's a saying, right? You don't shoot someone because they're a Nazi. You make them out to be a Nazi so you can shoot them, right? So they've demonized this guy to the point to where it would just be common sense that at some point someone's going to be radicalized enough to go after him. You don't have to hire an assassin. You don't have to make a plan. You just use enough propaganda to demonize someone, and eventually someone's going to make an attempt to take him out, which I believe is more than likely the case with Charlie Kirk. I don't know that. We don't have enough evidence yet. There's some questions I have with what the FBI's presented so far, to be honest with you. I mean, one of the biggest ones that I have personally is you got a video of the guy coming off the roof with a backpack, and now later on you have a 30-06 bolt action hunting rifle, grandpa's rifle, that was supposed to be the murder weapon, and which is not collapsible, and even if it was collapsible, wouldn't have fit in that backpack. So for me, I have questions. However, whether he was a hired professional, whether there was other people involved, you can't discount the fact that there was enough propaganda out there against Charlie Kirk to radicalize someone to make an attempt to take his life. And Charlie Kirk has now been assassinated, and he's unfortunately he's dead. Who do you believe the shooter was, and what do you think motivated him?
Well, I think fundamentally the shooter was Antifa, in the sense that he killed Charlie Kirk because he had been told that Charlie Kirk was a fascist and that fascists should be killed. Whether he was a member of a official Antifa chapter and conducted other actions and attacks with Antifa groups is somewhat beside the point. I think that's probably not the case here. I think probably he just received, as you said, the flood of propaganda that accused Charlie Kirk of being a fascist and so on, and he internalized that and he chose to act on it. But fundamentally, and I think it's important to note, you said they call people Nazis in order to kill them. They don't kill Nazis. And that's exactly the case in Charlie Kirk's case. Charlie Kirk is not a Nazi. They didn't kill Charlie Kirk because he was a Nazi. They killed Charlie Kirk because he wasn't a Nazi. They killed Charlie Kirk because he talked to people in the public square in a moderate and a persuasive way. And that is actually the purpose of Antifa. The earliest Antifa, as I said, in 1930s Germany, they didn't really attack the Nazis. They fought with them sometimes. The real focus for the Antifa of the 1930s was the center left, the Social Democrats, and the center right. They wanted to prevent a Weimar Republic Germany that could have a basic liberal democracy that had conversations, that elected people, and then those people got to govern, and that's what they were committed to preventing, and they did. Now, and that led, of course, to the rise of the Nazis and so on. Same thing with the rise of Antifa again in the 1980s. The target is not actually the far right. The target is actually the center. And so there is no more quintessentially anti-fascist act than to take out somebody like Charlie Kirk, who spends his whole day, every day, engaging in the basics of normal American politics. He
Trying to bring
talks to
people together.
people, he debates people, he registers people to vote, he gets people out to vote. He supports his policies, and he says what he thinks, and he engages in basic politics. That is what they want to prevent. They want to prevent you from engaging in American politics without having an armed guard. They want to prevent you from engaging in normal politics without acting like the fascist that they claim that you are, right? And we see this all across the board. We talked about targeting ICE. It's the same thing, right? You have people calling ICE secret police because they wear masks when they make these arrests, but they are only wearing the mask because if they don't wear the mask, you will dox them, and you will follow them home, and you will threaten their children, and you will threaten their wife, right? And so
Right.
you have forced them to act in the way that makes them appear to be what you claimed that they were. And that is that is the fundamental strategy of Antifa. And that is ultimately what the alleged shooter did in killing Charlie Kirk, was to try to take out the center. And so whether he was a member of a group or not, he operated in a way that Antifa would understand, and they would consider him one of their own. And so I think we have to recognize that there's sort of two things at play here. One is the actual structure of a real network of an organization that engages in political violence. Antifa has chapters, they have international ties, they have fundraising, etc., and those things can be targeted. But there is also then the inspirational element in which they, through propaganda, convince people to act on their behalf who may have no ties, and it still makes them Antifa. As I describe it, you have people who are members of Al Qaeda and they're members of a terrorist organization, and you also have people who commit acts of terror that they claim to be jihad, and they do it on behalf of jihad. And Al Qaeda says, "Good done, good job, well done," right? So,
Right.
Al Qaeda's magazine was called Inspire because they wanted to inspire people to commit acts of jihad. And so you have sort of both things going on with the threat that we're currently dealing with from Antifa. You have the actual structured threat of cells and networks and funding, and you also have the propaganda threat that is inspiring individuals to take action.
When the word Antifa is anti-fascist, is that a facade? I mean, clearly if they're killing people for having civil discord, then they are in fact the fascists, right? So, or they're hiding behind a facade of a fake name.
Yes and no. So they would say that anti-fascism is taking on fascism, but it's fascism as they define it. And on the left, among your Marxist and your anarchists, fascism is defined as late stage capitalism. So they view taking on fascism as taking on capitalism. They don't make that distinction. If you dig down into what they say and what they describe, that is the distinction they make. So you have to realize when they use words, it means what they say it means. It doesn't mean what you think it means. And they play.
So when they call you a fascist, and I define a fascist as two completely definitions of what a fascist is.
Totally different. And they do that on purpose to play games in such a way that they can take advantage of it politically, either way, and they can try to get people to buy into their movement. And unfortunately, they're very successful at that.
Yeah, well, I mean, and they've been able to mobilize a movement of woke of the so-called woke people in a younger generation use the word fascist quite a bit against capitalist.
Yeah, and they with you talk about the woke and the focus on minority rights, being part of a collective oppressed minority. That's part and parcel of this kind of ideology. Antifa views themselves as the defenders and sort of the security force for these sorts of quote unquote oppressed minorities. That's why they are so aggressive when it comes to the transgender issue. They view transgenders as an oppressed community that is under threat of genocide. That's the rhetoric that is used, and so they are motivated to use force if necessary to protect what they view as this oppressed community. And so that is also part of the reason why, and people have struggled with this, why there are so many individuals who are transgender who seem to be attracted to this Antifa ideology. It's because, to a certain extent, transgenderism is the only oppressed minority that one can choose to join. Antifa went out and they rioted and they acted in defense of Black Lives Matter as well, but they can't actually change their race. But they can change their sexual orientation and their claimed sexual identity. And so you see a lot of members of Antifa adopt that identity, partially for that reason.
Yeah, that's. I mean, we're seeing I've seen that quite a bit. A lot of transgenders. You get the furries, and everyone are attaching themselves to the transgender movement. Particularly, even in this case with the shooter, who's confessing his love for his transgender boyfriend. I can see where this could be a motivating factor.
Yeah, and you also see it, and there's a history in New Left terrorism of sort of using some of these identities to also insulate the group. So, like if you go back to the history of the Weather Underground, the New Left terrorists in the 70s and 80s that committed, literally thousands of bombings across the United States. One of the things that they would do is they would use sexual orgies to both bind the group together and also to help keep out law enforcement and other infiltrators. It is very difficult to get a policeman to take gender hormones so that he can infiltrate your group, right? So they realize that if they recruit among some of these ideologies, it sort of necessarily acts as a buffer to keep out people that when they're worried about infiltration. And so there's sort of two.
I've done a lot of undercover operations, but I've done a lot of undercover operations, but I'm not going undercover and being a furry or being part of your transgender orgy.
We could probably find you a decent mascot costume.
I'd be totally compromised. I'd back out. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, I'm still really perplexed of how they're organized and funded, because it appears to me more like an ideology than an organized group. Am I wrong with that?
Well, it is both. But most of your Antifa are what we would call ideologically either anarchists or autonomous Marxists, which means they're not in favor of hierarchies. They're not in favor of leaderships. They're all about bottom-up organizing. And so, the basic building block of Antifa is what's called an affinity group. And an affinity group is a small group of people with whom you have a political affinity. You have a shared ideology and a desire to work together towards some political end. Usually these groups are pretty small. 2 to 4 people is pretty common. They can get up to about a dozen people or so. Any more than that, and it gets very complex, in part because they have this autonomous ideology, and so it requires an element of consensus decision making. Everybody's got to be part of the plan. Everybody's got to be in on what's going to happen. Otherwise, it's very difficult to get agreement. So you have these affinity groups. Now, they can combine these affinity groups into clusters or chapters or collectives that allow them to take larger scale action. But at its heart, that affinity group is the core organizing principle. Now, this sounds difficult from a law enforcement perspective, because you're dealing with this sort of cellular network, but it's also a cellular network that changes very rapidly.
When you say cellular, I mean compartmentalizing groups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like cells.
but it's also a cell that can change its position very rapidly, and people are members of multiple cells that do different things, and so it can get very complex. But if you look at, for example, the makeup of a gang or an outlaw motorcycle club, you have sort of a similarity here, right? You've got a relatively small group of people who are usually co-located. They know each other very well personally. It's not uncommon at all for affinity groups to be boyfriends and girlfriends, husbands and wives, sexual partners, roommates, um, friends, and the like. So it becomes not just their political identity, but it becomes their social identity, their friend group, etc. And that makes them very, very tight and difficult to infiltrate. But they can use these affinity groups as building blocks through ideology and cooperation. So I mentioned, like an outlaw motorcycle club. So if you're in a gang or a club, if you wear the patch, if you fly the flag of that gang, you are a member of that gang, and you're expected to act in a certain way. You're expected to come to the defense of other members of the gang. You're expected to help them financially, to join in fighting your shared enemies, and etc. And there was a 2007 Forming an Antifa Group manual that was published online, and it explicitly said, if you identify as Antifa, you have certain obligations to the group. Now, these obligations are not written in stone. They're not, written in the monthly check that you get from Antifa International, but they're ideological. They're principles that people hold, and they do take very seriously. And so that's why you can have a relatively small affinity group in some place that doesn't have a lot of Antifa action. But if they sort of throw a flare up in the air, you can have dozens or even hundreds of Antifa flood into an area and create a much larger event than you would otherwise get. So you have these cellular networks, these affinity groups, and that builds the block all the way up to the regional and even international level.
I would say, which makes it very difficult for law enforcement because, if you're in law enforcement and you're looking at an organizational group, you're usually looking at not organizations that are bottom up, but top down, especially when you look at funding, which funding is usually, one of the primary ways to investigate organizations. And so any structured organization is going to have funding that's going to come top down and makes it a lot easier to investigate. But this makes it much more complex.
Yeah, the challenge you have, people have talked about using RICO and racketeering statutes to go after them, and there's some merit to that. But typically, especially at the federal level, racketeering is focused on money coming from the street and up to the kingpin, right? So the drug dealer on the street makes some money. He's got to pay his guy, who's got to pay he's got to pay his connection, who's got to pay protection, all the way up to the boss in his mansion somewhere, right? And in this situation, you don't necessarily, the money doesn't flow that way. It actually flows the opposite direction. And people struggle with this because you do have the large left-wing foundations that do fund groups that then fund organizations that then fund organizations that then may help organize a protest or reimburse protesters for taking part in actions, some of whom will be Antifa. And so the money is actually flowing in the opposite direction, and only some of it is ending up in the hands of people who are engaging in overt criminal acts. And so it's a little bit more challenging. I think we could find some places where you could utilize racketeering statutes, and I think we could definitely amend racketeering statutes in a way that would help law enforcement use this tool a little bit better. And we at the center have talked about doing that at the state level. We've talked to state legislators. We've amended some RICO statutes to include some of the criminal acts that Antifa does so that you could start looking at some of the community organizations and bail funds and fiscal sponsors that help them conduct these actions. But it's not impossible, but it is a tougher job than I think most people assume.
So I know you said we can't predict how President Trump is going to do it, but he said he wants to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. How would that designation help law enforcement?
Well, if you do designate them as a foreign organization, one, it would make any support for that organization itself illegal under material support statutes. it would allow you to investigate individuals for membership in that foreign terrorist organization. So simple membership in the terrorist organization itself would be a crime and probable cause for looking at other crimes. Um, which is the case. If you have reason to believe that somebody's a member of Hezbollah, you can start looking at them, even if you don't necessarily have evidence of what other crime they may be committing. And when you're investigating terrorism, that obviously makes a certain amount of sense, because up until a moment they commit a terrorist act, they may have committed very, very limited criminal
Right.
acts, or no criminal act at all. So you want to be able to look at people who have a membership in an organization, or are participating in activities of a terrorist organization. So you can approach it from that perspective. You could also go after organizations that are providing material support, and not just money, but also material support. Under the law, does cover a wide variety of support. Anything that has monetary value can be qualified as material support. So that includes providing services, providing transportation, housing, even medical aid to a terrorist organization is illegal. Providing propaganda services to a terrorist organization is illegal. So you could look at material support statutes as well, and it would clear the deck for taking them on in that way as
Yeah.
well. So I think it's worth doing. What I
Yeah.
wrote a recent article in the American Mind on some recommendations for the Trump administration on how they might think about going after them as a foreign terrorist organization. And what I recommended was find some of these Antifa groups abroad that we know exist. Groups in Germany, groups in Greece, groups conducting attacks in Hungary. Designate them as terrorist organizations. Then designate the national and international organizations that those smaller groups belong to, and then designate the American groups that also belong to that larger international network. And that would give you a way. You would be sort of building the case legally, and getting the bureaucracy to understand the threat a little bit better, get them to take it seriously because they have foreign partners that are taking it seriously, and get them to build up a designation in that way. So that's the recommendation that I made. The
Is
president
that
may.
public?
Yes, it's at The American Mind. I forget the exact title. It's something like taking on far left extremists, or something like that.
Okay.
And so we're seeing. We hope it's going to be something that the administration will find useful, and that they'll be able to take advantage of.
So, I mean, for me, that potentially kills funding, right? Because if you're, these globalists that fund these kind of things are certainly going to be a little more cautious of funding an organization that's designated as a terrorist organization. They'll have at least make it more difficult. Currently, who are some of the funders and organizers internationally of the things we see on the streets of America? I mean, we see Antifa groups radicalized, burning down American cities. We see as they're being called out and radicalized, there's pallets of bricks being put in the corners, and this is a logistical. I mean, this is like mastermind in logistics. Who's funding this? Who's organizing it?
Well, there's a couple of different theories on that. Obviously, you have some of your, as I said, your larger progressive foundations. Open Society Foundation by George Soros is obviously one. The Tides Foundation has been accused of some of this as well. And what they'll do is they'll push down money through a fiscal sponsor. These organizations are 501c3s. According to the IRS, they're no different than the Center for Security Policy. But what these guys do as a fiscal sponsor is they simply act as pass-throughs to other organizations that have no tax ID, that have no official organizational status. And so the foundation will say, I gave the money to this reputable 501c3 fiscal sponsor, and they sent it to this project that they said was an important project worth doing. Some of that money will go to bail funds and community organizations, which then engage in things like funding protests and reimbursing Antifa rioters. But it's very difficult to formally prove that the foundation did that on purpose. You also have, of course, foreign backing and foreign influence. Uh, you know, you have the influence of the Chinese Communist Party backing a number of groups operating in this space. The one that's most commonly been mentioned is the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which played a major role in organizing some of those ICE protests out in Los Angeles. And one of their former members is the individual who assassinated 2 Israeli embassy staffers in Washington, D.C. a few months back. Um, you also have a number of Cuban-linked organizations that have been identified as backing some of these groups. And very often what they will do is provide indoctrination and training. And they will actually invite individuals to travel to Cuba as part of what they call the brigades. There are a number of different brigades. The Benson Ramos Brigade is a term you've probably heard. There are a couple of others, the May Day Brigade, et cetera. And they'll send people to Cuba for indoctrination and tying them to the Cuban regime, and then they'll come back and they'll act as propaganda actors on behalf of the Cuban regime. But we know historically, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, the Cuban government used these brigades as an intelligence recruiting tool. They would bring Americans over to Cuba. They would then analyze them to figure out who was going to be a useful asset and for what they should be trained. In some cases, they engaged in providing guerrilla warfare and terrorism training to these individuals, and they then sent them back to the United States. And these individuals conducted acts of terrorism, acts of subversion against the U.S. government, organized protests and riots and the like. So if Cuba is following its historical model, there's reason to believe that they still have their hand in this game as well. So there's really a wide variety of bad actors at that top level who are all leaning into participating in all taking advantage of the effort to sort of pull America apart from the inside.
Yeah, when you have a foreign state sponsor like the CCP or the Cuban government or Russia, right, and they're using, the government is pumping fentanyl into the country. They're creating, they're investing in the sexual indoctrination of our youth and engaging in creating political discord. To me, this isn't like a criminal problem. This isn't a drug problem. Fentanyl's not a drug problem. This is actually state on state warfare, and it's very strategic, and it's no different than firing and in fact, in many cases, worse than firing a rocket into, off the coast of Miami into the city of Miami. This is, in fact, when you look at fentanyl deaths and things like that, it's much worse. And when you look at radicalizing a population group against another population group in America, it's much worse. So what is the gap in our government recognizing those acts as either acts of terrorism or acts of warfare, as opposed to it being a crime within a domestic crime?
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate reality is American counterintelligence has been really sadly um, abused in the last decades or so. I mean, historically, we have not been great at counterterrorism, counterintelligence to begin with, and it's only gotten worse. Um, in part because some of the bad actors in the U.S. government who participated in the RussiaGate stuff to try to slander President Trump as a Russian agent, including, by the way, FBI agents in counterintelligence who themselves were subsequently caught acting on behalf of foreign governments. So there's some question even of whether that whole, in addition to aiding the Hillary camp, whether that wasn't also in a way an effort to dismantle U.S. counterintelligence, because now if you tell somebody that you're concerned about Russian foreign agents or Russian influence operations or Chinese influence operations, they look at you like you're unserious and like, that's all just deep state nonsense. Well, it's not.
Right.
These are foreign adversaries that mean us harm, that are trying to divide us and bring us down, as you said, in an asymmetric warfare capacity. So we do have to take that very seriously. I think we've seen the Trump administration designating the cartels, for example, as narco-terrorist organizations, and even using airstrikes against drug trafficking boats, is part of turning the corner on that. And I think we have to think of,
Sure.
targeting the cartels in South America and Central America really as part of the fight against the CCP and the Chinese government, because that is one of the primary methods by which the Chinese government is seeking to damage and undermine us. And so there are, here domestically, we need to look at some of these organizations that are pretty openly operating as fronts for, a wide variety of bad foreign actors, from the CCP to the Chinese, to the Communist Party of the Philippines, to organizations on college campuses promoting North Korea. All of these things are a counterintelligence threat that could be addressed, but so far has not been actively worked.
Yeah, let's take this full circle back to Charlie Kirk. We look at Antifa as an organization that utilizes propaganda to incite violence against people that they would target. Charlie Kirk would have been one of those, someone that Antifa would have targeted. And then you see the shooter behaving in a way that's consistent with Antifa by putting, there's lots of ways you could identify, but one of the things that was most blatant was him writing "Hey fascist, catch" on the bullets. What are some other ways? First of all, what's that tell you? And what's your thoughts on that? And then what are some other ways that make you link him to Antifa?
Yeah, you mentioned the "Hey fascist, catch." There was also the Bella Ciao reference to song lyrics of an anti-fascist song from Italian history. And what we saw in the mainstream media to try to minimize what that obviously meant was actually, to me, one of the clues, because one of the things you see from Antifa is they will very deliberately, mock you claiming that they exist. They will deliberately use memes to try to undermine the seriousness of what they are doing, even while they themselves recognize it as a serious threat. One of the best example I can give you for that is there was a period where Antifa were using cans of soup as a weapon during some of these protests and riots. They would throw cans of soup at people because a heavy metal can hurts when
Sure.
you get hit
Yeah.
with it. And so police stopped a guy, carrying a big, thing of soup cans to a protest, and he said, "Oh, this is soup for my family," and that itself became an Antifa meme. "Soup for my family" was a big Antifa meme, and they all thought it was hilarious. Even as the same time they were using it to do real damage to people. So this sort of winky face, joke emoji thing, in my mind is just disinformation. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, clearly this guy was a gamer. Clearly he did, operate, in this Discord gamer space. He had his games that he liked. Um, but fundamentally, he expressed very clear anti-fascist thoughts. He told his gay or trans lover / roommate that he did this because he hated Charlie Kirk and he hated the things that Charlie Kirk said. Um, and then actual Antifa groups, on social media saw what he did, recognized what he did as an anti-fascist act, and lauded him for it. And so, again, whether he specifically ever attended a meeting, ever wore the black bloc, ever took to a street in a protest, almost doesn't matter. What matters is he internalized the ideology, he understood what it stood for, and he went out and committed an anti-fascist act. I wrote a piece in the Federalist where I identified, Robinson as an anti-fascist for this reason. One of the things I said was, painters paint. It doesn't matter whether it's your first painting or your 51st painting. If you paint, you are a painter. In the same way, Robinson did an anti-fascist act in their view, and therefore is an anti-fascist, and therefore is Antifa. So again, we have to sort of recognize that there's both the structured network of Antifa that needs to be dealt with through a variety of criminal and counterintelligence and counterterrorism regulations and statutes. And there's also the ideological challenge, the propaganda challenge, where they can indoctrinate people to act on their behalf, even people that they have never met.
In closing, what are you and your team at the Center for Security Policy doing right now to address this Antifa? Antifa as a is it on education? Is it on policy? Like, what is the Center for Security Policy actually doing?
So we believe that all policy should be grounded in education. So first and foremost, we are focused on the research to get it right, to really understand the way these groups operate and why and how they do the things that they do. Then we try to educate people on it. We are briefing law enforcement officers. We provide free of charge briefings to any law enforcement agencies, federal, state, or local in the country. As we say, if you can fill a phone booth with people to hear us speak, we will come and speak free of charge. As long as they're law enforcement or there's somebody else who has a responsibility to deal with this threat. We also are working with state legislators to pass laws that will allow law enforcement to more aggressively target this threat. So we're modifying state terrorism statutes, we're modifying state RICO statutes. We're looking very seriously at ways to improve state statutes for gang designations. We think that designating Antifa as a street gang would be a major tool at the state level. So those are all things that we're doing right now and have been doing for some time. At the federal level, there's a lot of education that needs to go on, and we're standing by, ready to help educate people on that. We're helping work with people in a variety of government departments on some of these larger strategic problems, the foreign ties, understanding the foreign role in some of these networks, helping them understand some of the fundraising methodology, how it works, so that they can start to craft their approach to take these threats on. And then, of course, educating the American people. Unfortunately, the American people, I think, have been poorly served by the media. Not your show. Your show is great, but but the rest of the media, they've been poorly served by. Even some of the conservative media, to be honest. People they want to look at Antifa as either morons in their grandmother's basement or super secret ninjas that are acting on behalf of George Soros. And as usual, the reality is somewhere in the middle. And so getting people to hone in on what is really happening, how it happens, and why it is happening, we feel like that will help them make better decisions. It will help them better support their elected officials, their law enforcement officials as they take on this threat, because that's going to be fundamental. If President Trump does move forward with taking on Antifa, he will need the backing of the American people. The American people will need to say, we are tired with lawlessness. We are tired of people being murdered and assaulted for speaking freely. And we are going to back the president as he does what he lawfully has the authority to do. And because if they don't do that, the Trump administration will ultimately not be successful. This is not going to be a one and done thing overnight. This is going to be for the long haul. We're going to have to deal with this threat for a long time, and we should dig in and be prepared for that. And the Center for Security Policy is here to assist anybody who has that mission, who has the responsibility, that duty to serve. We are here to assist you with the knowledge that we have. And if we don't know, we will find out. That's our job. And I tell law enforcement officers that all the time. If you have a strange flag or a strange piece of graffiti and you don't know what it means, just send me a picture and just say, hey, dude, you ever seen this before? And if I don't know, I'll try to find out as best I can.
And they could write them for the Center for Security Policy website, which is we'll have in our comments. They could just contact through there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they can book a law enforcement training and the like.
Yeah. As you're talking, I have another question that popped up. How influential, especially in this topic, are the sheriffs in America? I mean, we see during an election, the sheriffs are so important. Where do they fall into this?
I mean, for me, sheriffs are really preeminent as American law enforcement. Now, that depends a little bit on what state you're in and what statutes they have. That if you're out in the West or in the South, the sheriff could be the most important elected official in the whole county. If you're in the Northeast, sometimes they end up, being treated as sort of glorified jailers, and they don't have necessarily the authorities that they used to have. I think that's unfortunate because having elected law enforcement actually does matter, especially at the local level when you're interacting with the American citizens the most.
And
When
just
I
so that
talk,
the audience listening, the reason I mentioned that is there's a difference in exactly what Kyle just said. Chiefs are get promoted up most of the time or appointed, but sheriffs are elected by the people, and that's why I asked that question.
well, consider some of the radicals that are now moving in to try to take control of the mayor's office in a number of our major cities. New York City, you've got a democratic socialist, essentially an avowed communist, trying to take the mayorship there, who has openly said that he wants to abolish the police, defund the police. You've got individuals throughout the country that are very radical, that are taking some of these city council positions, mayor positions, and they can lean very heavily on these chiefs of police. Now, I know a lot of really great chiefs of police and a lot of great police officers, but they are often subject to political pressure that a sheriff, because he can go right to his voters, is just not subject to. Now, a lot of sheriffs will tell me, I'm in a rural county. I don't have your Antifa types. That's not a big deal for me. But this guy who killed Charlie Kirk allegedly was from St. George's, Utah, which is about 300 miles away from Salt Lake City, their major urban center. So just because you think that you're in a rural county or you're in a suburban county and you say, I don't think that this exists where I am, you're probably wrong. It probably does exist at some level. And as I said, Antifa is a traveling clown show. So if you have one or two of these guys in your rural or suburban area and they shoot up a flare, you could have Antifa from all over the country descend upon you, and we saw that in 2020. So I warn sheriffs, like, don't think you're safe just because you have maybe a more rural or a more suburban area of operations. And also, sometimes these Antifa guys will set up their areas of operation in the rural areas, and then move into the urban areas in order to conduct activities and then move out again. We saw that in the BLM riots, where they positioned themselves in some of the Virginia counties and then moved into Richmond or moved into Washington, D.C. to conduct their actions and then moved out again. That's probably something you're very familiar with your
Yeah.
background, Chad. There, to a certain extent, some of these aspects of what really are insurgency or maybe proto-insurgency, uh, some of these behaviors do take place across ideological lines, and you sort of see, it may not be the same, but it definitely rhymes. So I do warn people about that.
We could go on and on, Kyle. I could ask you questions on this topic all day long because I'm so interested myself. So I'd love to have you back on. I know we want to do a full episode on a show, but I'd love to have you back on, and especially in the future, and topics like this come up. But what would you, in closing, what would you advise to anyone that wants to know more about Homeland Security, counterterrorism, topics like we talked about today? Where can they go to get more information?
I would urge them to check us out at centerforsecuritypolicy.org. All of our writings are there. All of our media appearances are there. We publish books. We publish long form reports. And very often you just don't get the level of in-depth analysis in this media culture that we have today. So if you actually want to sit down and read a monograph on where this stuff comes from and what the history is and how it works, the center is here for you for that. So I would urge you to check us out online. You can also check me out on X. If you're on X, my account handle is at Shidler K, and all my work is there. And I do a lot of pretty long threads sometimes on some of these issues. So if this is the kind of stuff that you're interested in, I'd ask you to give me a follow.
Yeah, man, thanks so much for your insights, your wisdom, and all the work you guys are doing at Center for Security Policy. And shout out to Tommy Waller, both a friend of ours. He's such an incredible leader, an incredible patriot, and I am grateful to be part of it, and look forward to having not just you but Tommy back on the show, some of the other experts there. You guys got so many leading experts in different areas that I want to have on the show and just help educate, inform, equip our audience to be more understanding of what's going on in our world, because knowledge, to me, knowledge and wisdom is resilience, and that's what this show's about, being resilient. So God bless you, man. Thank you again, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.